the thing that confuses me the most and the thing that frustrates me the most, I guess, when I have discussions with socialists is socialism feels like this very amorphous, ever transforming idea of what it actually is, such that I don't even know why we use the word anymore. So I'm very glad that you've acknowledged that Marx, in through his labor theory value analysis, was absolutely flawed and was an absolute failure. I'm glad that you've acknowledged that the way of analyzing.
I have not acknowledged. You're making this stuff up. I've never acknowledged anything of the word.
Okay, well,
I don't even know where you get this.
Well, earlier you just said that we shouldn't hold ourselves captive to the thinking of thinkers in the 19th century in terms of what socialism is. So I assume you've evolved
No, I didn't do that at all. I told you that socialism has a variety of theories within it. It's a broad tradition. It had to be. In the 150 years since Marx wrote, his ideas have moved into every country on this earth at different levels of economic and cultural and political life. And of course, those different people all found something valuable, but they all made their own interpretations. This is a rich, diverse tradition. It's as if you're going to decide what it is I mean when I say these things. I never said that the Marxist theory isn't valuable, that the labor theory of value doesn't apply. If you read any of the books and articles I've pumped out in my life, you'd know that the exact opposite is the case.
Wait a minute.
I want to correct something about China because you keep repeating it.
Okay.
You know why private enterprise and private capital flows into China in the 80s and 90s? Because China had transformed itself from a place where nobody wanted to invest to a place like now where everybody does. Capitalist enterprises went there because they had a well-educated, disciplined labor force at very low wages, because they had built an extraordinary infrastructure, because you had a growing level of income for people to buy things. That's why General Motors produces and sells more cars in China than it does in the United States. The reason private capital went there was because they had, before the arrival, created the institutions. Every other part of the so-called third world, Asia, Africa, Latin America, who had received since the Second World War massive amounts of foreign aid, were desperately trying to do what the Chinese were doing, namely, develop their countries so that foreign private investment would come. China didn't get any foreign aid because they were communists and the United States didn't give them any. But they did a better job than all the countries who did get it in order to get to the point of economic development where it became interesting for capitalists in Japan and Europe to go there. You need to pretend, for reasons I do not understand, that all of the achievements I've just described didn't happen, that somehow they don't deserve the credit. Look, in the world of economics, perhaps you're not familiar, we do exactly what you just said we oughtn't to do. We look at societies and say, they have a capitalist economic system. How did they do? And they have a socialist system with the different meanings of that term. And how did they do? And then we say they're different, and part, not all, part of the story is the different system. And if I say to you that the socialist tradition has multiple interpretations, let me assure you that the capitalist tradition does as well. The leaders of Saudi Arabia right now call themselves capitalists.
Can I ask you, when you say socialist, what do you mean when you say socialist then? I'm trying to understand what this means. Can you give me like a cohesive, coherent?
That's good. No, let me answer. They're a variety. I'll give you three basic strains right now. They don't exhaust it, but they enable us to have a conversation. One strain, you leave enterprises in the hands of private capitalists, but you recognize that that capitalist system is so flawed, for example, in terms of inequality, in terms of business cycle instability, that you give a role to the government of massive intervention, rules, regulations, laws. You know, let me give you some examples. In France, it's the law that once you begin working after graduating from high school or college, every employer has to give you 5 weeks of paid vacation from the beginning. Nothing like that exists in the United States. But this is a society that won that for its people, by the way, by socialists who did that and put that on the books, as it is on most European countries. And socialists do that because they believe for them that socialism is when the government comes in and regulates. That's one kind. Here's a second kind. These second kind of socialists, they don't believe it works real well if you do that. It's not enough. So they want to take a different step. They want the government to come in and actually own and operate enterprises, not merely regulate them with rules and laws. Then there's a third kind, which I stressed a few moments ago, which is not about the government. Doesn't care all that much whether the government runs an enterprise or the private does. They can figure out whichever one works better. Let's be real practical. But for them, what socialism means is the transformation of the everyday life of working people. No longer do you go to work with other people telling you what to do, where to sit, what machine to use, what raw material to work on. And at the end of the day, you go home and you've got nothing more to say about what you poured your brains and muscles into. No, no, no. For these socialists, like me, the crucial thing is to reorganize the workplace, to bring real democracy, can you believe it, to the place where we work. In a country that claims to be democratic, we don't have democracy in the workplace. We have a tiny group of people telling the majority what to do, fully unaccountable to that majority. You know, if we really believed in democracy, this kind of socialism argues, we would recognize that that's where adults spend most of their adult life, at work. And if you really believe in democracy, it should have been installed in the workplace. But capitalism doesn't permit that. The folks at the top want to keep the power to keep their inordinate wealth, even at the expense of no democracy and of a growth record inferior to what Russia did in the 20th century and what China is doing now. And that's an enormous price to pay.
Okay, so if you want to talk about the 2 and 3 definitions of socialism, that would be interesting to me, but I only heard 2 definitions of socialism here. Number 1 is just capitalism. I don't know when this redefining happened of taking capitalism plus government intervention and calling it. Wait, well, let me finish. Right? I don't know why this was the case that state intervention into private markets to have some form of regulation or some form of socialized healthcare or giving workers 5 weeks off became socialism. It is clearly not socialism. It's so not socialism that I think Marx himself even said that the state would be heavily required in maintaining capitalism, more so than I guess even Marx was able to foresee, because he predicted a revolution of the proletariat in his lifetime. The idea that the state intervening and providing some sort of social welfare or safety net is that's just strictly a capitalist system with some government intervention. If we want to talk about the concept of the government owning and operating enterprises, or number 3, the idea is that the workers themselves have some worker managed thing, I would be interested in discussing either of those 2 options, as I believe all 5 questions I laid out initially applied to them. But for number 1, I wholly reject that as a form of as a form of socialism. If you believe it is, I'd be curious if you can tell me what is the difference between the first thing you laid out and any capitalist that acknowledges that some level of government intervention is necessary in keeping the economy going.
I'd be glad to explain it to you. The history of socialism gets going in the middle of the 19th century. And at that time, socialists began to argue that capitalism was over, capitalism was done, and a better system was available and should be pursued. And they had a whole bunch of ideas about that. They were a relatively small group. If you know the history of Marx and Marxism, it begins relatively small. As the 19th century progresses, it gets larger and larger. And guess what happens when that movement gets larger? Debates begin to happen inside of it as to what in the world capitalism is and what in the world socialism is. And here we go. Some of the people decided that socialism as a radically alternative system wasn't in the cards. Could never happen in some views, could only happen in a distant future. Well, what then did socialists do in the meanwhile before a real change of system happened? Answer: advocate for the government to be taken over by universal suffrage. The mass of people would institute a socialism that was, if you like, a step in that direction. an early socialism, if you like. And by the way, there were big debates, pro and con, within the socialist movement about this. But they settled to understand, let's call it one kind of socialism. And that's what you have in Western Europe, in Scandinavia, to this day. Socialist parties advocate that, and the people in that society often vote those folks into power. I'll give you an example. The government in Portugal right now, a perfect example, European country. The government of Portugal is a coalition of three political parties. The largest is the Portuguese Socialist Party. The second one is the Portuguese Communist Party. And the third one is the Portuguese Green Party. They were elected as a coalition government in 2016. They were re-elected last year. Parenthetically, if your audience members don't know about this, that's because you live in a society that doesn't tell you about this, even though it's public knowledge to anyone interested in finding out. Those parties push a socialist agenda by which they mean government rules and regulations. You may not like to call it socialists, but the people involved, and millions of them around the world, do. The other kind of socialism broke away from this first kind in the aftermath of the Soviet Revolution. They were in favor of taking that extra step. Socialism for them meant that the government should take over and operate enterprises, at least the industrial ones, maybe later the agricultural ones. And to underscore their distinction from the other socialists who just wanted government rules, regulations, and controls, they gave themselves the name communist. And that's the only difference between them. And it has been that way for nearly a century now, since the Russian Revolution. And then there's this third one, which has to do with transforming the workplace. Those are all socialisms. They argue, they debate, they have a rich literature. We have lots of empirical examples of all three kinds in the world. And if people want to think about how they work and what kind of society they produce, there's loads of evidence there. We don't have to hypothesize or pretend or demonize either, because really it doesn't lend itself to that if you're serious.
Okay, first of all, just because a government calls itself socialist, I don't think that that's adequate to define said government as socialist. Do you agree with that?
Good. Give another. Fine. You can have another. That's what the debate is about. You make up your definition.
Hold on one second.
Well,
yeah, okay, so we have to give Destiny a chance to speak as well.
Yeah, wait, well, so my question would be like in terms of like...
have opportunities to give...
I guess like, would you consider like, for instance, like the Nazi Party, would you consider that a socialist party as they have socialism in the name? It doesn't seem like a good...
No. But
why not?
The minute you know anything about the Nazi Party, you'd understand that.
Would you say that is Portugal a socialist economy? Or do they have markets? Do they have private investment?
Markets have nothing to do with socialism.
Okay, can you tell me what is your definition of capitalism then? Because when I ask you what is socialism to you, I'm like, I understand that you can talk a lot and you can tell me what other people have considered socialism to be, but under your current definitions, for instance, the democratic... No, you haven't given me your definition. You've told me what other thinkers and what other countries in the past... Your definition is not what Portugal does, or it's not what the Portuguese Socialist or Communist Party is. You're giving me what other people or other thinkers have thought what socialism is. Because under your current definition, number one, the Democratic Party in the United States would be considered a socialist party because they're in favor of heavy government intervention in terms of climate change or healthcare. And I don't know if you would agree. Would you agree that the Democratic Party in the United States of America is a socialist party, or if they rebranded themselves? Okay, so it's clear then that the naming mechanism alone isn't enough for you, because the Nazi Party obviously called themselves socialists. I don't think many people, me included, would consider themselves socialist. And it's obvious that there must be some outside definition that you're alluding to, that when you call something socialist. So I'm just trying to figure out what can you tell me, what is capitalism to you? What does it mean when an economy or a society is a capitalist economy? What does that mean to you?
Well, let me answer. I gave you three definitions of socialism. I told you they weren't the only three. This is a debate that's been going on inside socialism, and it's perfectly reasonable for me to give you those three. It might be nice for you if there was one you could cling to, but that's not the way it is. The tradition is too big, too broad, too global for there to be one definition, as there is in most interesting things in the world, and certainly in many large organizations and large traditions. I did give you my own. My own is focused on the transformation of the workplace. It's more interested in the micro transformation than in the macro ones, and particularly skeptical about the power of the government as having had some bad consequences. I want to learn from these early efforts to build socialism so that the future revolts against capitalism will have a better outcome than the ones that we've already had.
What is
they
capitalism?
Let me finish. They achieved many things we want to hold on to, and they made some mistakes we want to avoid. And that's exactly what it means to learn from the past.
Why didn't you open with this moralizing argument? I tried to, but the problem is that like anytime I asked him any question about anything, it felt like it felt like my debate with Pogut. It felt like he never wanted to make like a concrete point or argument. It's hard for me to tell. I try to be generous to my people my interlocutors. I try to be generous and say maybe I'm not understanding something. Or maybe I'm just missing something, but I feel like I'm reasonably intelligent and I feel like I have a decent grasp of these topics. If it feels like you're dancing around in circles and it takes you so long to answer any question, like if I just ask questions like, well, what is capitalism to you? Or like, what is socialism? Like, can you give me, and you have to talk for 3 minutes and it's like a 200-year long answer. Like, I don't know, it feels to me like, it feels like a bit of obfuscation is occurring. Or rather, if I don't want to go the bad faith route, but maybe they do this unintentionally. What it feels like, this is what it feels like to me. It feels like you're scared of giving me a concrete definition because you know that any definition that you give is going to be inadequate and that you can be attacked on it. Maybe I need to find a way to put me on the defense more on my things, because the frustrating thing is if you would ask me to define anything, I tried this at one point of the debate, but then Wolf ran from it. It was over the Bezos thing. I can tell you exactly why a CEO gets paid what they do, and I can tell you exactly why any worker gets paid what they do, right? We can talk about like the marginal cost, that the next unit for the marginal cost of labor going into the next unit, the marginal cost of a product, right? We can talk about supply and demand of different types of talents in the workplace. I can give you exact answers. I don't have to talk for about 200 years ago, somebody said this and that's why. Like, I can give you exact answers to all of these. I feel like you should be able to do the same for any explanation that you're giving, The 3-card game he played with the 3 definitions of socialism was amazing. He claimed that Portugal was socialist, so socialism works, but he advocated for the third form, not the first. Yeah. It reminds me of when Unlearning Economics was saying like, oh, well, 15 an hour minimum wage can be good. Here's all these studies that say $12 minimum wage is possible. It's like, okay. I hate to admit this. I hope my mom's not in chat. The conservatives were right, I guess. Socialism to people is just when the government does stuff, I guess. That was definition 1. I didn't get to like any of my 5 challenges. What level of violence is acceptable for you to reach a socialist state? How do we decide which businesses are allowed to exist in a socialist society? But it felt like he squirmed around a lot of these. So like when I asked him, because I asked him like, so are you saying that like only co-ops can exist in the society? He said, well, no, but I'd like more co-ops than private firms to exist. Well, how do you enforce that?
I appreciate that, Destiny.
All right, bye. Remember to hit that like and subscribe, and don't forget the notification bell so that my videos show up right in your feed.